Hello everyone, my name is Antonia Hadjimichael. And this is another interview organized by the River Basin Planning Policy and Operation Committee in collaboration with the Environmental and Water Resources Systems Committee as part of the Environmental and Water Resources Institute, which is under the American Society of Civil Engineers. And in today's interview, we have Professor Patrick Reed. I will let you introduce yourself.
I am Professor Patrick Reed, or Pat. I am at Cornell University. I'm in Civil and Environmental Engineering in the Environmental Water Resource Systems area. I've been at Cornell now a decade. Since 2013, I spent my first 11 years as a faculty at Penn State from 2002 to 2013. So that's me.
So the first sort of question that we ask everybody is, how would you characterize your work or your involvement with water or modeling water systems?
I mean, anyone who has been around me for any length of time gets my mantra of defining the problem is the problem. And a lot of our group the group focus has been focused on wicked problems and water resources from a multi-objective perspective, and then thinking about deeply uncertain futures. And so the way you can think about that in brief are, I started early in my career trying to algorithmically and through simulation understand what are the trade-offs. And then once we got more powerful tools to understand the trade-offs, then it became very clear to me that we were making some egregious assumptions and that we have climate change and human drivers, all these other things, so we could be very wrong. And so then the next question was vulnerabilities, and so there was a phase of what if the trade-offs we're looking at aren't actually the trade-offs that manifest, and so we moved to that. And then after we start really getting better at the vulnerabilities, and then it became clear that there are a lot of interdependencies across the actors, across the systems, across the dynamics. And so then we moved pretty heavily into the diagnostics. So I would say trade-offs, vulnerabilities, and dependencies sort of as a cornerstone of a lot of our work.
On a personal sort of question, would you say this whole philosophy around examining problem framings and understanding complexity, do you see that resonating personally with what you value? Like if you were in a water systems person and you are doing something else, do you think you will bring the same sort of lens?
I mean, one of the interesting things, and I think from anyone who is thinking about systems analysis, a lot of the tradition that we have is the concept of optimality, which is, a representation of value systems, whether we, tacitly assume that or explicitly acknowledge that. And a critique is that can be very distant from the lived experiences of individuals impacted in that. And so one of the questions is, if you're a systems analyst, is the tool or the tradition that you're following mathematically more important than the actual problem context and the lived experiences of the individuals? And if you wouldn't live with the recommendation, then you probably shouldn't make it. And I would say, nothing is perfect. And the state of engineering as a whole and water resource systems specifically, there's never going to be perfect. And you don't want to be frozen to inaction. But I would say over the course of my career, I have learned to embrace broader value systems, broader framings, bringing more people to the table, trying to understand broader uncertainties, and try to stay humble to the math is fun, but you should be humble in the face of the human experiences that it may shape.
And speaking of these human experiences and the real world applications, is there one or maybe a couple of modeling projects or water systems analysis projects that you consider from your career to be the most successful? And what was your role in that, and why do you think they were some of the most successful?
I mean, I've had a tremendously long record of good fortune with the students, PhD students and postdocs that I've interacted with over the years. The first phases of my work and me as an early faculty, I was very, very technical, and it was trying to reach the kind of problems that I wanted to solve. And then in sort of, around 2009, 2010, we started making pretty major breakthroughs. And so I'd say, without going into a huge amount of specifics, two major collaborators that have had a huge influence on what I think is success in building long-term relationships. One is with Greg Characlis at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the other is Andrea Castelletti at Politecnico di Milano. So in that process, we've built a lot of really, I think, engaging learning experiences, and I would say some successes. And the example is the research triangle and water resources investment pathway planning there. The Tampa Bay region, Greg and I have developed really good relationships. And I'd say in terms of what I would say the successes in, for example, North Carolina, or there's new work in Tampa Bay, is about building trust and rapport with the utilities. With Andrea, we've had a bit more of an international collaboration, and there's been things where we've exchanged students, but the hallmark of, I'd say, our successes has been, meeting the problem where it's at, but having, a really open and dynamic collaborative approach to really going in and understanding the systems and advancing control. I would say the singular most challenging, and I'm not going to take credit for the success, but work with Tom Wild when he was a postdoc with me, and Pete Laux in a very large collaboration with Natural Heritage Institute, looking at the Sambor megadam in the southern Mekong as impacting Cambodia. That was probably one of the, most humbling experiences in terms of learning from economists, legal perspectives, ecologists, interactions with the ministries. Natural Heritage Institute did an amazing job, and our team served as, I'd say, facilitators. One of the interesting things is there was a lot of debate within the decision support team, so you don't hear that a lot. That, suddenly you know what your recommendations are and you just go. But the reality is there were conflicting recommendations or perspectives, a lot of different framings. And to his credit, Tom, built a open simulation, PySedSim, was interacting, and, through our collaborations along that, it ended up, I think, having a real world value.
And from interacting with you, a lot of these projects seem to take a long time to get to have a relationship with the stakeholders or the decision makers where there is trust, where they let you break things or they let you try things. So these projects typically, would you say, over decades?
I mean, some relationships now are, which makes me maybe start to feel a little bit older, are teetering post-decade, 10, 15 years.
You can say it in dog years.
Yeah. I'd say, it's long, it's trust building, conversations with Tampa Bay Water, for example, with Tirasu Asefa, who's a fantastic collaborator, and they have an amazing operation. But we started, conversations about ideas in 2012, and really active work together, 2017, and we've been building from there. And, it varies from place to place. There are cases where there's success in building that rapport and relationship and sustaining. There's cases where it's gone as soon as the project funding's over. But I think the thing that, a lot of times people like our presentations, but they don't like the answer that the hardest part and the most important thing was the trust building and the relationship building and having mutual respect. not treating stakeholders like some, homogeneous collective, right? Every system has a diversity of needs, and it's, relationship building.
Yeah, and to pick up on you said some projects, stay on and they keep working on it for a long time, and some of them it's a one-off. Could you think of an example where you characterize a project, maybe it's a one-off and it's a success, but were they unsuccessful at times working with people?
Yes. I guess part of that is what the definition of success is. In my experience, often when you get into a really complex system that's not purely academic, you end up actually solving a different problem that you initially conceived. Some of that is learning from the stakeholders, some is that showing them what you can do and them learning with you. I'd say the without naming specific systems, the most common trait where it's been extremely difficult are sort of three factors. One, there's extremely limited continuity in funding, and so to build the relationship requires a fair amount of ingenuity into itself, and that may not always be possible. And that's also in terms of students and, just connections. I think a second factor in that is the openness and the tools and the capacity of the system that you're working with. Is, some folks are very open, transparent, and some are not. If you looked at the correlation of where we've had the highest success and insights, it's those that are open. The systems that are not open, their tools are limited or highly commercial. Frankly, it's been very difficult to do work in those circumstances. And then I'd say the third element of that is just institutional stability. So sometimes, a utility will get new management, or there's, shocks in the system. We try to treat climate or these other major stressors like they don't have an effect on the institution itself, but it affects the people, the capacity, the ability to invest in their own planning.
Yeah.
And so there's been many cases where simply, through a myriad of reasons, total change in leadership and, relationships end.
Yeah. Because relationships are also fundamentally about people. If the right people are not there, or the people that are there are not open, or they're used to one way. And this kind of relates to the next question I wanted to ask. You mentioned transparency and openness. You probably see a fundamental relationship between the development of the tools, like the widgets that we bring, or the model that we bring, and the actual application. So how has that interaction been in the projects that you've been involved in?
I find that as academics, we're often in love with what we're most comfortable with in our tool base. And we have this sort of strange, if only I communicate slightly better, you'll take my model as it is. And what I've noticed is every major system where we've done really good work, we had to rewrite the models. And in doing that, you're adding complexities, uncertainties, or other elements, or new decisions that are really complicated. And those aren't represented in the existing tools when you started. So then we had to build that in. It's a slow process, but it's the way that you innovate, and it's not necessarily easy. I think taking shortcuts because you prefer a methodology versus being open to meeting the system to the point that it's actually at, and the types of questions that are being asked may mean that you have to fundamentally change your tools, your approach, your perspective, your hypotheses. More than once we walk in the door with, this must be what's important to you, and walked out of the door with, oh, clearly we were wrong.
Yeah. And it relates to that thing you said at the very beginning about how defining the problem is the problem. Because if you assume the problem is well described or well framed as you're walking in, then it will affect you. Well, you'll get an outcome, but it might or might not be reflective of what is actually happening or what the people care about.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between doing interesting, credible work that's publishable and then doing work that is strongly relevant
Yeah.
to the actual system, and then moving past that into, communicating your insights through that institution's, contacts, participants, advocates, where it actually goes into the decision processes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, and the other thing is it's not stable. So people, when you go to the grocery store, your preferences are dynamic and opportunistic. You're like, oh, I like this, well, until I see that. But a lot of times in the way that we treat decision problems in systems, that doesn't happen. But the reality is when you go in the room and you're working with folks, when they see one version of the problem that might say, oh, that's really interesting, but you missed the following concerns, or can you add these objectives?
Mm-hmm.
Or even our terminology, like the math, objectives, constraints, decision variables, that's not necessarily real world vocabulary, right? And so thinking about how you convey what you're doing in that space of math and what you can answer and what you should answer, it's a collaborative dialogue, really.
Yeah. I read a distinction recently in a paper that distinguished between useful science and usable science, and you kind of you might need both. So, and I feel like that interaction that you're talking about is what makes usable science. Not in the sense of like purely applied, but more like I am framing this so it has direct relevance and usability to somebody instead of just, it could be a modeling exercise that gets published. Nobody uses it. And have you seen maybe, I don't know, because you've been actively involved with your stakeholders, but have you seen how that directly shapes an outcome outside? I know you define objectives based on what they tell you or metrics based on what they tell you. You probably see very direct relationship on the answer that you get.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things. One is I see the fiction that if you actually do things that are useful, that it's consulting, not science. False. So the reality is there is a balance, but the reality is, one of the things in decision support, it's not necessarily an act of confirming what is requested, right? You may show folks that their system is not attaining what they think it is, and that it is highly vulnerable in ways they may not have expected. And those are challenges to that. And I think bringing in social sciences, communications, and broadening that out. But even from the engineering perspective, right, that is good science, right? Taking insights and moving into what they find is actionable. I think on the other side to the question of there's sort of the philosophy of tools. And I find in some cases the philosophy of tool is more important than the problem at hand for some folks. And so with the investment in relevance may require a change in the entire way that a problem is formulated, such that it's no longer a particular style of formulation that some folks prefer. And, so what they'll do is they'll make prescriptive recommendations from the outside and, focus on what they feel the system should be doing without integrating into the realities of what the system is doing or the complexities. And there's some benefit there, right? If you can say in an idealized assumption, this is, the most efficient way that this could be working, but efficiency for who, impacted how, with externalities where and for whom, a lot of times I don't see as much interrogation on those later questions of like, what is the actual consequence of our definitions of optimality? Because it's an extraordinary filter, right? So as soon as you go very far in one area that you think is really critical, you are likely exposing yourself to risks that you are neglecting other, highly decision relevant factors and actually impacts on individuals. And I think that's where a lot of the tension and opportunity is now in thinking about things like equity more actively.
Would you say that to me, I wasn't trained as a systems engineer, but I use a lot of systems framing in my work, and I feel like it's so central to that, having that perspective, because you're not coming to the problem as a hydrologist or as a operational, like a strictly operational person, a strictly hydrology person, or a strictly, a financial assessment person. It's a systems perspective kind of forces you. Maybe you don't do it very well, but it forces you to think of the system as a whole and the knobs and how they come together.
I mean, we do it so reflexively as engineers, in particular, because my training is engineering, that we don't even think about it. I mean, you start getting introduced to decomposition, formal, you got a complex world and we're going to decompose the world. And free body diagrams and all of this to the literally, by the time you're a senior, it changes the flavor of how you see complexity in the world. Mm-hmm. And that's important, right? You do need tractable ways to take action. I think one of the challenges we have and one of the opportunities that systems bring is like, how did we draw that box? What did we cut out? What do we have in? What are the actions? What are the interesting feedbacks? What are the things that we may be neglecting? And not everything can be addressed at once. But, thinking about your priorities and the implications of the way that you're initially decomposing your system, going to model it and try to make recommendations, that's a pretty pivotal step and often neglected. It's interesting. In a lot of our science models, hydrology models, things like that, it's pretty common to talk about the structural uncertainty of the model, the fact that, we don't understand necessarily all the processes. I find it far less common that there's that discussion that the problem formulations in the system side also have strong structural uncertainty. And not only do they have uncertainty, but they themselves probably change over time as the system's evolving or co-evolving. So I think thinking of it more as a discovery learning process versus a well-articulated formalism, in at least my view, that's probably a better approach.
I want to change gears a little bit and talk a little bit about modeling broadly, and what you think or how you envision the role of modeling in river basin planning in the future, say in the next 20 years.
I mean, I'll sort of take a step back. I think one of the most successful things in the systems analysis area, if you start thinking about the transitions of, the work from, computing emerging in the 1950s into the 1960s, the amazing work, Harvard Water Program and, colleagues at Cornell, Pete Laux, Jerry Stedinger, Christine Shoemaker, a lot of these things that emerged in the 60s, 70s, and many other people besides them. I think simulation actually is like the rank one breakthrough that seems to have permeated a lot of facets of river basin operations and management. There's, amazing people like Dan Shear, Hydrologics, and his OASIS model, are in real operational context. Where river basin commissions are using that model to understand, the basics. Here's the state of the system. Here are the operational actions or the planning actions. And then here are the consequences. Where do I see this going? I think the systems are being stressed beyond comfort now. And it's hard to deny that. And the challenges aren't coming one at a time now, right? You get a mix of different seasonal shocks or different issues that are emerging. And so as a consequence of this, I think there's a need for the tools to evolve to be open science. And it doesn't mean that there isn't realm for consultancy and all these things, but the reality is that the systems are evolving, and our understanding of what is the state of the system that we care about, the actions that we want to consider, and then the consequences we want to quantify with objectives or vulnerabilities, it's expanding. And you're going to need more and more people to bring the brain power that you need to these, to operationalize decisions, whether it's short term or long term, or even, the journal for ASC, Journal Water Resources Planning and Management. That's a decomposition. The reality is, if you do better short term management, that sets you up in a pathway for better planning. We don't necessarily engage with that path dependency. So in short, I think we need to think more broadly. I think we need to do a better contextualization of our water resource systems as being part of broader, complex, adaptive human Earth systems. As we're filming today, we have poor air quality in Ithaca from wildfires in Canada. That's new for the East, but the reality is these types of, where you're having droughts or heat waves or floods or sequences of human pressures are not reducing, right? And so if we're not open in our science, open across our disciplines, and I think, to end that out, that, when I say that we need to be creative and bring more brain power, I think one of the major deficiencies that we have right now in systems is that we have too little social science, quantitative and non-quantitative. And I think in the future for river basin modeling, I think we need to take that more seriously and take it to equity, take it to lived in experiences, take it to new framings that we at present aren't even conceiving.
And it will probably transform the process too. The process through which we do things.
We would have to.
Yeah. And so you mentioned open science, transparency, having more disciplinary interaction. What about sort of technical or technical advances or technical things that need to change to maybe improve how we do things?
I think we have opportunity and the costs and maybe externalities from those opportunities. The computing that we have now, the rise in artificial intelligence, not as a theoretical thing that might be at some point in the future. Major tech companies that are coming in and looking at river basins as opportunities to bring their toolkits and their extraordinary large scientific, engineering, and technical capabilities, that's not slowing down. Academia is behind. So we're already losing that race in terms of the open, public, free, non-proprietary toolkits. And I think it's not to say that those aren't great opportunities in bringing tech in. I think we should leverage everything we can. But I guess the question is, whose values at the end are part of that? Defining the problem is the problem. And you have a values alignment issue where our ability to optimize, control, and actuate is starting to, go back and realize the aspirations that Herbert Simon had in Sciences of the Artificial in 1961, which was, a major motivator of the Riddle and Weber wicked problems critique. The reality is we are doing things. We are actually having social network engineering. The social side of river basins now comes into question, right? How they interface across different sectors, different scales, and different impacts. Who's impacted? So I think on the positive side, we can do more than we've ever been able to do and encompass more in our problems. On the negative side, I think we could continue to reinforce myopic solutions that don't engage with the actual emerging risks and needs and the lived-in experiences of the people that are going to be impacted in the river basins in the future.
Reinforcing the sense of you had one way of doing it, you use that framing, and now you have an extremely better way of doing it, but you're still using the same way. You're blowing up the same approach, basically.
That, or I mean, you're comfortable in your definition of optimality, but your comfort in that definition of optimality, it neglects the actual externalities and the effects of who it excludes from the solution. I think participatory approaches, bringing more people to the table, is not going to necessarily make things easier. And often I think it's nice to substitute some clear, concise, actionable formulation, which eventually you're going to have to do, with less engagement. It's an attractive thing.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a balance. I guess one of my questions is, how much human in the loop do we have, and who are the humans that get to be in the loop? Because there are elements now, even in our day-to-day, between our phones, our cars, and everything else, that we're not fully aware of actually all of the behavioral trace data signals that we're giving, and how that's being used. I mean, and I don't see that actually decelerating. And so I guess the question is, as we automate and make things smart, who's we in terms of the benefits of that integrated innovation? And are we reinforcing biases and systematic prejudices and things along that line that have existed for quite some time, that eliminate people from the problem at hand, when we're in circumstances where in the future there's potentially even more people that are transitioning to extraordinarily vulnerable states, and then people that have historically and consistently been in vulnerable states.
So we're kind of coming to the end, and I feel like this lends itself very nicely to my next question, which you have been talking about going forward and what's needed to sort of tackle this river basin planning now and the complexities around it. If there was an undergraduate just starting now, what advice would you give them about their career or their path that you think would be most useful going forward?
I mean, as an undergrad, the first thing is be open to learning and don't feel like you have to solve all the complexity by your sophomore year. So you're going to evolve, and as you move through your career, each stage of that career is going to get you ready for the next level of questions, whether it's in your classes or whether you're in work or projects. And I think one of the things I'd suggest for undergrads is lead with impact and passion. Like, what are you really interested in? Be curious and be bold in your aspirations. Bet on yourself. It's easy to assume when you read all the stuff that exists that you don't have the right to actually participate in that historically, overwhelming dialogue that exists and all the work that's been happening in river basins. But the reality is you do, and you're needed. We need more people. I think on a technical level, being very open to flexible toolkits, the ability to be quantitatively flexible, while simultaneously not neglecting your electives to broaden yourself, to think about social sciences, to think about social systems, to think about river basins not as, it's not just hydrology. People live in these things. There's social systems, right? There are infrastructure systems. There's institutions. So you might not tackle all of that, but it's good to have a breadth of training, both that is, quantitative and flexible, and at the same time opens yourself to the diverse perspectives and different disciplinary approaches that are out there that are really critical. That I think, and a lot of times in classical, especially for engineering training, is just neglected. And I think that's where we're going. I mean, I see this interesting thing where you're trying to help undergrads wield artificial intelligence innovations, while simultaneously they need to contextualize the social dimensions of what the implications of that tool base is going to be. And I'd say those are the two things in terms of broadening out the skills from where they're at right now, while still, again, I can't emphasize enough, betting on themselves and, you know, finding those elements of that they are passionate about in terms of impact.
Could I ask you one last question? It's not on the questions they gave me, but I like asking this question. If you could go back to early in your education and give advice to yourself, or is there anything that you would do different? You would approach different? Study something else?
I mean, I was a poorly informed undergrad. I was academically, you know, I did well. But when I was making the decision for grad school and I was thinking about the different things, there were a lot of happy accidents. I mean, my whole career could be considered a happy accident. I wouldn't change anything because, you know, my lack of vision, you know, led to a lot of fun adventures and some, you know, rough learning experiences and humbling but important insights. But I think going back and just thinking through that, I think the thing that in the stages of my career, I came out of an undergrad really not knowing what I wanted to do or be, and that's okay. So I would go back and tell myself, that's okay. And then, you know, getting to the University of Illinois and finding out, it turns out I'm not the best student in the class. And that whole, you know, talent compression, again, that's okay, right? It's about the learning, it's the journey. And then I think, you know, what I was just saying for the undergrads, I think there are those tough moments when you're doing a PhD or you're, you know, a junior faculty and you're doing your first grants. And you got to find the center core foundation of what the passion is about. Because that's probably the most sustainable way to maintain the energy and the investment and the enthusiasm and the infectiousness of being, you know, the job that I'm in, which is a faculty. And I would say, I think I'd give myself periodic reminders that, you know, stay stably connected to those centers of passion. And those evolve over a career, especially with new insights.
Okay, well, thank you for the interview. Is there anything else that you would like? I feel like we got a lot of wisdom and a lot of hindsight, but yeah, I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to share.
I think one is just thank you all for this activity. And anyone who suffered through a very long video of my ramblings, thank you for your time and attention. And then I guess the ending would be we need you, right? We need folks to come in. We need help. We need perspectives. We need diverse voices. So please consider yourself invited to Water Resource Systems Analysis.
Oh, I think that's a perfect ending. Thank you very much.